Morning, everybody. I guess I'll take my coat off. I'm freezing. Um, I was just looking at my Instagram. I'll read you. I know you all wanted to see what my friends are posting. Um, Here's a good one. This is from my friend Troy. He's got a picture on here of like a little bit of snow on the ground, about a quarter of an inch. He just said, "We survived the biggest snowstorm in the history of mankind." And he follows that by, "Freezing rain is really scary." Seriously, what is going on? Our news people, they're like, I think they're trying to compete with like Fox News Alert or Wolf Blitzer, the Situation Room. Everything is to be feared. We live in Michigan. As a reminder, it gets cold in the winter and occasionally it snows. Um, so I was just in Israel for a week, and they were having some historic rain and cold weather as well. And so I flew yesterday. I got up at um, 2:15 in the morning, went to the airport, flew from Tel Aviv to Paris, and while I was in Paris, my flight from Chicago to Grand Rapids was canceled a full 24 hours before the storm, just in case. Um, and then I landed in Chicago and rented a car and drove through the apocalyptic weather we were having, which was rain. Uh, and it was a little bit messy, a little bit dicey there at the end, but I made it. So I'm not sure what time it is, but I made it late last night, about 10 o'clock I got home. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad we didn't cancel. Cherry and I were talking. I thought, you know. Anyway, what I'm saying is, I don't know what I'm saying. I'm glad to be here, um, and yeah, I want to talk a bit about compassion. If you've been following us now for a while, starting in the fall, we've been just looking at our values again. Again, we're a community that holds values sort of at the center of who we are. They're both aspirational and also convictional in a sense. I read through the values and I believe them, and in a way I believe in them, if you can believe in a value, but I'm drawn to them is probably the best way to say it. And I think, yeah, that's how I want to be in the world. And I also find them challenging. I find I'm actually not that. Um, I have much more to grow into, I guess would be the right way to say it. And especially this month, all month, we want to be talking about our value of compassionate action, which I already like the dual nature of the phrase, compassion and action. And the way we've expressed it, if you look on our values online, we talk about human rights, and we talk about social justice and peace. And I think that's interesting because it's trying to give language to something that's nuanced. Like, yeah, I'd like to be a compassionate person, and I'd like to act on that in the world. Well, in what way? And I think the value is trying to say something like a braid exists, like a cord, but it has three parts to it, and they're all sort of interwoven: social justice, peace, and human rights. And maybe any one of those on their own is limiting. Like, if you're all about social justice, systemic social justice, you can sometimes neglect the basic humanity of your own neighbor, human rights, like someone right down the street. Or if you're all about pursuing peace, sometimes you can neglect really facing the injustices that need to be somehow righted or addressed. And anyway, you could do your own thinking along those lines. How are these three related? Social justice, peace, and basic human rights. And I want to talk a little bit about social justice, I think, today, but I might wander around as I'm prone to do. Um, and anyway, that's kind of the aim and direction. And I just think it's interesting coming off of an Israel trip because it's a complicated place, Israel. I've been going there for 20 years, and I've been leading tours there for 17 years, and I lived there for 3 years. And I don't know what's going on. and it gets more complex. I think that's probably one of the frightening things about evolution itself. It moves from simple to complex. So tough, you know. That's just the way it is. It's increasingly slow, complicated, and difficult. And I've started noticing something over the last few years. So I want to say a few things about Israel, and then I'll try to say some things about social justice. So a few years ago, I started saying to people that I lead trips to Israel and Palestine. So that I was saying both things, Israel and Palestine. Although that's very complicated. What is Palestine? And even what is Israel? What is the state? So, and I've received different reactions to such a phrase. Like one would be, I say, I lead trips to Israel and Palestine. Someone might say, you mean Palestine? And I think to myself, do you have a year to even begin a conversation? Or I get the opposite. I lead trips to Israel and Palestine. You mean Israel? Palestine is not a state. Okay. It's one of those contentious places. You can't even say, I'm going to this part of the world without making somebody mad, which is why I like to take people. Because I think it's a place where dualism is usually gets all the news attention, meaning pro this or pro that, pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. And you very much need to decide where you stand. And in fact, so much so, it's not as bad so much there. Palestine is a really complicated place, even politically. There's something like 36 political parties. So that's a relief, in my opinion, like finally. I don't have to have one monolithic monstrosity speak for me, which it doesn't anyway, you know. But in any case, it's the kind of dualistic divisiveness in our country, in our nation, and in our world. It's like a microcosm of such a thing. And it's always wanting you to decide, where are you? And if you're not on my side, I can't even talk to you or even address you. So I know a guy in Galilee, he lives in the Golan Heights, which is a disputed territory. Well, sort of, it's disputed. It depends on who's doing the disputing. But the Golan Heights is an area that used to be Syria until 1967, and before that was under the French Mandate, before that was under the Ottoman Empire, and before that was under the Byzantines. And before that it was under, and I could just keep going all the way back. So he's an olive farmer. He has something like 75,000 olive trees, which is a lot. I'm happy if my 6 tomato plants grow. In any case, he was talking recently to a group, and he happened to mention something it was an American group, and he said something thanking America for its support of Israel, and he mentioned a political figure. Not Trump, by the way, somebody else. I can't remember who he mentioned. And 2 people got up and stormed out and said, we won't stand in your shop. And I thought, he sells olive oil. That's what I mean. In terms of cutting people off. Not asking, hey, what's it like to grow olives in the Golan Heights? Just, I need to know your ideological position so I can decide if you're safe or not, or if you're with me or not. This isn't getting anybody anywhere. And this is not compassion in the most simple sense. Compassion means with, kon, and passion, like pathos in Greek, with emotion. Feeling what it's like to be someone else. And that's not easy. Sometimes, I can barely do that with my own spouse, you know? Feeling the feelings of someone. So to say we want to be about compassionate action is a tall order, really. It's like, oh, I have to open myself. I have to be vulnerable enough to listen to somebody and even feel what it is they're feeling, even if I don't agree with their politics. And more than that, we've added to that, not only do I want to have compassion, I want to take action in the world. It's tall. It's a tall order. It asks something of courage, like in the French sense, a big heart, you know? And when you have a big heart, you might get hurt. and nobody loves to get hurt. So these things aren't easy to talk about. So anyway, coming off an Israel trip, these things have been floating around in my head, and I was talking to a couple friends of mine while I was there. Um, I got, in a way, I got kind of lucky. I moved there to go to school, to go to graduate school, and then I happened to find a pretty small Christian community there who was, in their words, pro-human. So not wanting to say pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, and there were Jews that were part of this community. There were Palestinians and Arabs, and there were lots of expats. And big surprise, it wasn't a giant megachurch. It was a tiny community because it was really mixed up. And anyway, my two friends are now pastors there. One of them was born there, and one's a permanent resident. And we were talking about this kind of maybe third way of being in the world, which definitely is unique in this church community. But they were sort of correcting the way I was putting it, and they were saying it's not walking a kind of middle road where you're just like, hey, thank you for sharing, and then to the other side, we see where you're coming from, thank you for sharing. It's never that simple. You always actually find yourself zigzagging on all kinds of issues. Like one day you might, to use big categories, you might be 70% pro-Israel on some specific thing, and the next day you're 70% pro-Palestinian, and then the next day and then when people see that, they think, wishy-washy. You don't know where you stand. But in my mind, that's closer to what life is like, right? I know I can guess how many of you vote, but I can only guess. And if I really were to hammer you and go line by line, like let's say where there were 100 questions that, I don't know if such a thing exists. Let's say I just made up this test and there were 100 questions and by the end it nailed you, exactly where you were. There'd be no way for me to guess how you would answer all 100, correct? Half of them you would probably say, I don't even know how to answer this. So that's more what life is like. It can feel like zigzagging, and especially if you're committed to compassionate action. Really compassion and trying to listen to what it's like to be someone else. The other thing that struck me just coming out of the Middle East is that history matters. And I'm actually changing my mind about that because I used to say history matters for a variety of reasons, and then I got kind of cold feet about it, especially when it comes to modern politics. I'd be like, can we stop talking about the book of Joshua or Salah ad-Din or whoever? Like, let's just let's just live in the now, okay? The Irish have a great saying. The thing about the past is it's not really in the past, right? You know that even from your daily experience, all of a sudden you can feel like you're 12 and you're standing by a parent, your own dad, who's shaming you, and he's been in the grave for who knows how many years. You know what I'm talking about? The thing about the past is it's not really the past. So history matters, and when it comes to compassionate action in the world, I think we bear even more responsibility to struggle with history a bit. What brought us this far? What's carried our communities? What are the narratives that we've been telling ourselves? And once you open yourself up to telling the narrative you're actually telling, you're forced to listen to alternative narratives. And it's really in the alchemical mixture between the two that something like the truth emerges. It's not like you get to share your story, my truth is my truth. And then the next one, my truth is my truth. Something in there's wrong and something in there's right. Correct? I love Ken Wilber says, no one is smart enough to be 100% wrong. So it's one of the best lines of all time. You can say the same thing, like, no one is smart enough to be 100% right. And that requires some humility when it comes to the narratives that we tell and the narratives that we listen to. This same olive farmer, after these two people stormed out, this is give you a window into Israelis. He's like, he stopped in the middle of his presentation and went after them and said, don't walk out on me. and tried to engage. And he told them something interesting, and which gave me a little just insight. He told them that every single kid born in Israel has a little chip implanted in their head, and that chip is the Holocaust. So the fact that he was telling these people, somebody did something that we think helps us, we're surprised by and grateful for. And to me, that's, first of all, that's true from all the Israelis that I know. There's a collective trauma behind the state of Israel. It's also true from a Palestinian perspective. If I could switch it, every single kid, Palestinian kid, especially deep in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, has a little chip planted in their head, and that chip says, Israel's the devil. And they've taken our land and killed our people. Do you see how there's some truth to both narratives, correct? So what do you do with two people who both feel victimized? That's a tough situation. That's a tough situation. And we know something from contemporary psychology. You know what doesn't work? If you're a victim, get over it. You know? You're still talking about the Holocaust? Come on, you know? Let it go. You know, nobody's really, but I promise you, that kind of attitude finds its way into the political realm and into how people listen to one another. You have to have a certain measure of humility. And I keep saying it because I love it. It's another act of courage to say, tell me what it's like to be you. You know, tell me what it's like to be you. And something like that is needed in this conflict, which is a microcosm of something global. Okay, let me tell you a parable. And it's one of the more famous parables, a social justice parable. So you probably heard it before. And I think even if you have heard it before, maybe it's worth just turning over a bit. So the parable is something like this. There once was a village that lived by a river. And as long as they could remember, they were the river people. And they took care of this little corner of the, like a river bend. They took care of this, and it was their home, and it brought their community meaning and life. And one day, down the river came a dead body. And somebody pulled it out of the river, and they kind of gathered together, the village, and they tried to identify the person, and they couldn't. And they started a whole conversation. What should we do? And eventually someone said, well, if this were me, I'd want to be buried. I wouldn't want to just be put back in the river and, you know, sent on my way. Let's honor this person and bury them. And so they got together and they all chipped in, and some people dug the grave, and they had a ceremony, and the whole town came out and they buried the person. And it became a pretty kind of powerful event, and sort of shaped even a sense of who they are. And only to find out, or only to experience, about a month later, here comes another body down the river, and they see it and they pull it up and they say, hey, we should definitely do what we did before, because that was such a meaningful experience for all of us, and it's a way of honoring this person, and how would you want to be treated? And they pull the body up and they bury it. And as the months go by, more and more bodies start coming down the river until they have a whole system. And they have someone who sits in a watchtower that looks for the bodies. They have someone who retrieves the bodies. They have someone who digs the graves. They have someone who puts on a special robe to do the sacred rites. And they have singers. They even have people that weep. They have a whole system. But nobody at any point in the village says, where are they coming from? That is a parable about the difference between charity and social justice. Charity matters, like compassionate action for the most unfortunate. And it matters. But it's not the same as social justice. Social justice is saying, we got to find out what's happening and who are these people and why are they in the river? And you don't know what you're going to find out if you go upstream. You could find out that when anyone dies in the community, the way they bury people in the sacred way is to put them in the river and they float them on down. Or it could be that they're all being killed. Or it could be you don't know what you're going to find out. And that's very much true if you get into social justice work. You start peeling off one later and you're like, oh crap, like the Middle East. You start off saying, hey, I'm pro this or that. And after a couple years, you're just confused. So the reason why I like this parable is because I think it's an invitation to enter the complexity of compassionate action. It's one thing to do nice things for people, and even to take care of the most unfortunate people in your local community and even in your own family. These things matter. But it asks something else to say, what systems are bringing this about? And that's a conversation about social justice. And it leads us right to the heart of a kind of paradox. And so as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about there are a number of paradoxes involved when it comes to social justice and compassionate action. And the first I might say is not very contemporary. How many of you think it's a good thing not to judge somebody? Now you can already tell it's going to be a setup, all right? I agree. You know what you can't do without judgment? Social justice. You can't do it. You got to make judgments. It doesn't mean that your judgments are going to be right all the time. You could be dead wrong about something. But it does require some measure of judgment. And what I mean by that is weighing the situation. Is this right? Is this wrong? Do we think this is a good thing? Is this causing more or less suffering in the world? All of that requires a certain capacity of making judgments. And actually at times saying, we think this person or this group or this system is wrong. And that doesn't feel very good, especially to really progressive people. We don't want to tell people they're wrong, which is funny. It gets us into a weird dilemma. It's kind of paradox in a way. So we don't want to be judgmental, and we also need to make judgments. Welcome to the complexities of social justice and compassionate action. And I might also say this is rooted in the very word justice itself. Justice is about finding inequalities and trying to make them right. You cannot fix them. Like even if there's some massive inequality and you go after it, it's not like at the end you've completely righted the situation and people are like, well, it's all fixed now. It doesn't really work that way. You enter into the complexities of the injustice and try to make it right. You try to make it right. And to the best of your ability. And the other paradoxical side to that coin is mercy. Justice and mercy are at odds. Have you ever felt that? We sometimes put them together, but they're actually at odds. Because one is about going after something and sometimes saying, this is wrong and has to be taken care of. And mercy says, we forgive that action. They're always in that kind of tension. Justice and mercy is one paradox, I think, that's worth sort of pointing out when it comes to social justice. Here are some more. I got a whole list, but I'm not going to list them all because I see I went too long anyway at the beginning. Actually, I'll let that go. I'll move on to something else. Let me say something about social justice and the Bible. So last week, by the way, I heard you talked about psychedelics, mushrooms, psilocybin, and ayahuasca. Welcome to C3. This week I'm going to mention some things about the Bible. Oh, man. See, the Bible is a very interesting book, and it comes back to my first about what I said about history. I do think history matters, and the thing about the past is not really in the past. And the Bible has a very particular storyline. Like when Martin Luther King Jr. says what does he say? The arc of no, the arc of something bends toward justice. The arc of the universe bends towards justice. He's saying that in part up out of his own biblical tradition, because that's very much the narrative of the Bible, believe it or not. I mean, here are some basic tenets. Everyone is created in the image of God, male and female. That's actually quite radical. Even the earth has rights. It does. That's in the book of Genesis. Society is measured by how it treats the most vulnerable. Okay, that's from the Bible. The prophets are absolutely screaming at the political religious establishment for how they treat the poor, the widow, the alien, and the orphan. That's their full-time job. They just scream constantly. You guys are a bunch of losers. All right, that's the prophet. Jesus says the measure of being in the kingdom of God is whether or not you visit those who are in prison, those who are sick, whether or not you clothe the naked and feed the hungry and give water to the thirsty. That's his litmus test. Again, from the Bible when it comes to social justice. Jesus also says he goes after the religious establishment by saying, you give a tenth of your possessions, even your mint and your cumin, like they're measuring out everything and making sure a tenth goes to the temple or something like that, but you neglect justice and mercy. That's what he tells them. And of course you have in the Bible, love your neighbor as yourself, which is not a saying of Jesus. Jesus just uses it. It's in Leviticus. And when was the last time anybody said anything positive about Leviticus? You know? It's one of the oldest books in the entire biblical tradition. And there it is, love your neighbor as you. It's like a surprise. And maybe that's enough in terms of the arc of things. The Bible is sort of saying something like this. When it comes to social justice and compassionate action, I might add, this isn't about your own private morality. It's about the state of society. It's not just about you being a good person. It's about what are the systems that are oppressing people. And that's a big question, right? And now, I think, this is fine, Jesus in the Bible is fine, they're saying all this stuff. In some ways, and I don't know if I can prove this, but in some ways, it's less complicated then than it is now, in some ways. How big were the rings? You have family, geography, your religion, the political establishment, and maybe have some empires that are your neighbors, and that's about as far as the rings go out. You've never heard of the Mayan people, which were around at that time. You've never heard of them. You've never heard of Aboriginal indigenous people in Australia. Didn't know they exist. You see how the rings don't go out very far? So it's complicated, but it's not that complicated. Now, it's like seriously complicated how far these rings go out, right? Touching upon more and more and more things. I remember a few years ago, I bought an Apple product that was a red Apple product, meaning the color was red and also a portion of it went to support HIV aid and research. I thought, this is a good thing to do. And look how compassionate I am. I want a new iPod, and look how moral I am in buying this. It's a good thing. I'm glad Apple's up to this kind of stuff, and they're doing some good in the world. But it's complicated. Is that how moral of an action is that in terms of private morality? Well, private morality has its limits because eventually you start have to asking questions like, where does the magnesium come from? Where does the aluminum come from? What kid mined these minerals so that I could post "don't mine minerals" on my Instagram? Do you know what I'm saying? I'm just saying it's complicated. I don't have answers, but I'm saying social justice now and the question of compassionate action, it's like we've dug the hole quite deep. And that's the way it is. So welcome to the complexities of being in the 21st century. The question is, are we going to sit up straight and have some courage to face all these complexities? And really engage in these kinds of questions. Seems like, at least that's what I'm hearing. In other words, social justice requires us to have a public conversation, not just a privatized, I gave my 10% or something like that. Am I making sense? By the way, I'm preaching to myself. I mean, I hope you hear that. I'm looking at myself right now. Speaking of psychedelics, I'm imagining myself there and I'm speaking. Anyway, we know too much, in other words. We know too much. And there's a quotation here I want to hover around as a way of concluding here. And this is from a writer named Elizabeth Johnson. And she has a book where she talks about what she calls a postmodern spirituality, which is a phrase that I like because that's the state we're in now. Where whatever postmodernism means exactly, it definitely means after-modernism, which is the state we're in. We're in this kind of postmodern milieu in all of its ambiguities and complexities. And so she's talking about a spirituality today that, here's the quote, seeks wisdom, not in the clear and distinct ideas of what is claimed to be universal reason, that's modernism, but what is in fact the thought of privileged men. So in other words, what we once thought was rational, reason, universally accepted, all you had to do was just be a rational person, was actually, we're finding out, was in the wheelhouse of privileged men. Rather, this postmodern spirituality, it honors the plurality and ambiguity of human consciousness. Plurality and ambiguity of human consciousness, sensitive to the difference that difference makes according to one's social location, gender, race, class, and culture. You've heard this kind of stuff. In other words, zip code matters in terms of worldview and perspective and narratives and experience. And when it comes to compassion, feeling with, zip code matters. And people have different narratives. And she's saying that's the state of affairs in the postmodern world that we live in. We can't go back. We wake up to find ourselves inhabiting this world. The compass of postmodern spirituality points not to rampant individualism, which is where everybody thought this was going. Like, hey, my truth is my truth, your truth is your truth, just, don't bother me. I just thought of a Bob Dylan line. I'm not going to get it right now. Or I thought of a Bright Eyes line. Why do you say there's no meaning, but say it as if you're right? It's the best. That's that privatized, ultra-individualized, in a sense, narcissistic bubble that I was picking on a while back. We thought that's where it was going. She says, no. The compass of postmodern spirituality points not to rampant individualism and its violent outcroppings, but to the importance of community and tradition. Community and tradition. Prizing human solidarity and peace. Because if you're going to value community and tradition, you have to prize human solidarity and peace, because it's hard to get along. Especially if you're going to say, you have the right to exist as a human being, and your community and your tradition matters. You know when France tried to ban the hijab, the head covering? That's a mistake, in my opinion. That's totalitarianism all over again in the name of liberalism. You can't wear a head covering. They also said, you can't wear a cross if it's big. I always thought that was funny. Small ones are fine. Or a kippah, a yarmulke. So we're trying to say we're going to make it blanket. No, like, who's that rapper? Flava Flav with the giant cross, or with the giant clock, but like the cross version of it. That's banned. That's like saying you can wear a hijab if it's a small one. Doesn't make any sense. Anyway, what popped into my head is I just was talking to my friends about this in Israel, this very thing. So, okay, I'm going to finish the quote and then we'll be done. It prizes, this postmodern spirituality, prizes not human supremacy over the earth, but effective kinship with the whole community of the cosmos. That's what that Einstein quote is saying. Kinship with everything, including the earth community. In a word, postmodern spiritual experience prizes not isolation, but essential connectedness. Not body-mind dualism, but the holistic, embodied person. Not patriarchy, but inclusive feminism. Not militarism, but expenditure for the enhancement of life. Like I saw a political ad, I'm not telling you who to vote for. It said, Bernie Sanders wants to send your kids to college, not war. Not tribal nationalism, but global justice. And global justice requires making some judgments. Even the bitter kinds of judgments like self-examination. How are we contributing to a less safe and unhealthy and dangerous and violent and myopic and dualistic world? How are we contributing? And those are big questions. So I think that's all I wanted to say today. Let me just do a check-in. And in a way, I'm grateful to be a part of this community, where we get to ask questions like this, and that both shine a light on, I think, the world we're all living in, and also shine a light on the kinds of people we want to be. So with that, I'm glad to be back, and I'll see you soon. Thanks for listening.